So tonight we're going to talk about GraphQL and Apollo, as you've heard like 10 times now. But so brief intro on me. Name is Keenan Jaenicke. I work for a startup in Zionsville called 120 Water Audit. We do water testing. We build the software for the actual collection process, and then the kind of looking at the analytics on the kind of the data that's being returned from the labs. So we use React on the front end, so Microsoft's tech on the back end, as well as Node. We're kind of transitioning over to more of a Docker, Kubernetes, Node environment. So that's a little bit about me. So we're going to cover kind of two topics tonight. We'll talk about GraphQL, go through history, explain kind of what it is, talk about kind of some comparisons between REST, which you've probably used most in the past if you've been working with APIs, and then do some comparison between that and GraphQL, talk about different implementations of GraphQL, and then we'll get into Apollo and talk about ways you can use Apollo, what languages and things that come with using Apollo. So GraphQL was created at Facebook in 2012, and it was created out of the need for improved mobile performance. I don't know if you used Facebook's mobile app around that time, but it was essentially a web view that was just wrapped for mobile, and it was terribly slow there, and trying to solve a lot of performance issues there. And there's a really good article by Lee Byron. He's an engineer at Facebook. It's in the resources at the end of this presentation. So definitely check that out. So after Facebook worked on GraphQL internally, they eventually open sourced the project in 2015. All right. So here's a quote from the actual GraphQL website. Not going to read it, but one of the main points here is that this is really mostly a query language. So you're querying your existing data. So this isn't going to replace your database, and it may not even replace your existing APIs entirely. It's going to solve a very specific need. All right. So the good old Morpheus meme here, but what if I told you that you could actually ask your API for the data that you want to receive? And that means kind of the shape that you want to receive back in your response, rather than you call some API and it gives you either too much data or not the one specific thing that you want. So that's kind of what GraphQL is hoping to solve. So there are kind of 3 steps we'll go through here. The first being you need to describe the data that your API is going to return. So hopefully that's big enough, but this is an example of defining a type in GraphQL. So we have a project, and it defines a string name, another string, a tagline, and then a collection of contributors. And those are a user type. So it looks something like this, with maybe a name, string type, things like that. So you describe your data first. Next up is, if you are consuming this GraphQL API, you're going to query the data, the types that you've exposed. So in this case, we're going to be looking for a project, and we're going to be passing in a parameter name, and specifically we're looking for GraphQL. Notice inside here, tagline. So we are only wanting the tagline back in the response. One of the things you might be noticing is that it almost looks like JSON, or like a JavaScript object, but it isn't. There's no commas when you're defining your responses, so just be aware that it's a little bit different kind of syntax there. And then this is what your response looks like. It's the single project and only the tagline. All right, so let's hop over here. Hopefully this is large enough. I can make it bigger. So we're going to write our own query. And first off, we're going to take a look at the actual GraphQL API that we're going to be using. So this is a public API that's set up so you can essentially kind of get your feet wet with GraphQL. So, and it's actually the Star Wars GraphQL API. So if you're a Star Wars nerd like me, this is a great project. So we're going to look at the person endpoint that we have here, or we're going to look at the person type first. And we can see that there's a name, birth year, eye color, things like that are exposed on this person type. One of the great benefits with GraphQL is that it is typed. So when you define those types, they can also be exposed to your developers as essentially as your self-documenting API. So you can take a look at what's available in your GraphQL API just like this. So we're going to be writing a query, and we're going to look for a person. So we'll say person. And then we are going to pass in the person ID. I just so happen to know that there's a person ID of 1. And you can see that it's highlighting saying that I need to tell it what fields that I want back. And with a name, and let's just say birth year. So we can run that, and there we go. That's all that we wanted back, and that's what the GraphQL API returns to us. Additionally, you may want to see related entities. So for instance, the home world of this person. And again, maybe we only want to see the name. So we can run that. There we go. Everyone knows Luke is from Tatooine, right? So just kind of shows you the power of that kind of that static typing. You know what is available to you, but at the same time, it's self-documenting more or less. So any questions about that? I know that was kind of a lot. We can pause on that. Real quick, this tool is called GraphQL. There's a lot of fun names in the whole GraphQL space, but all right, cool. Yep.
What kind of data sets in GraphQL language are you plugging into a database like the Postgres or MS SQL, or is it limited to documents from the website?
Right. It's not limited to any of those. You could actually use all of the above that you just mentioned, but I'll get to it. But yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. All right. So oftentimes you're picking technology. Oh yeah, this is slightly matrix themed. But anyway, a lot of times you're picking technology and it's like one or the other, right? And it might be the case for you if you're building a really simple CRUD application. GraphQL might be all that you need, but at the same time, you may opt to use GraphQL for only a portion of your application. So we'll do a little bit of compare contrast here. So first up, well, it's the new hotness. So not REST, got to go with it, right? No, that's not a good reason to go with it. But so one of the kind of core tenets of both, you could argue, is that they're both resource-based. So you're going to be working with a thing or a collection of things. So like in the previous example, you're working with a person. So you'll have, in REST, you're going to have your person endpoint. You're going to do your gets, post, put, delete on that person. With GraphQL, you're going to be working with a person type. So that's your kind of resource that you're working with the GraphQL. You're still going to be using HTTP to do your requests, although you don't have to. You can use JSON just like you're used to. with your responses. And then, now this is a big one, is the response shape. So kind of touched on it already, but it's up to the server to determine what the response shape looks like with REST. There are, obviously, you can kind of get around that by including like certain parameters within your request to only return the columns, but that's not something that you would just already do. Versus with GraphQL, as long as the types are available to you, then you can determine what the response looks like. And then last up is number of endpoints. So with REST, that just totally depends on how many resources you're working with. It can just grow from there. With GraphQL, you have a single endpoint that you're working with. And from there, you have queries and mutations that you can access from that single endpoint. All right. Oh yeah, one other thing on that real quick is that, so with the resource-based approach, with REST, you're going to be using different HTTP verbs to specify your different actions that you're wanting to do. So if you're deleting something or updating something, you're going to change the HTTP method that you're using. With GraphQL, you're either going to be writing a query if you're fetching data, or if you're changing data, you're going to be writing something called a mutation. Okay, so a couple, I would say the most popular implementations of GraphQL are Relay and Apollo. So Relay is from Facebook, and then Apollo is spun up from the Meteor team. I don't know, Meteor's kind of been around for a while, really good developers on that team. And then there are definitely a few others. I think there's like Micro GraphQL or something. There's a number of smaller kind of implementations out there, but Relay and Apollo are definitely the two big ones that are out there. And Apollo obviously is what we're talking about later on. All right, so the kind of tagline on Apollo is to write queries, not code. So you're essentially fetching the data that you want, writing that query with your components, and then instead of writing the code to essentially chain that together or get all of the data you need, you should just be using your single GraphQL endpoint, and that's kind of what you ideally would use Apollo for, is talking to an Apollo server with an Apollo client, and we'll talk about that. So there's kind of three core parts to Apollo. So that's variable. Okay. So you have your Apollo client, the server, and then your engine. The client is how you're going to request data and update data that you have with your GraphQL API. So there's a number of different implementations of the GraphQL or Apollo client. Your GraphQL server is just what you would expect. It's your actual application serving your GraphQL API. And then the engine. We won't really talk too much about the engine, but it is something that Apollo offers for caching, error tracking, and logging. Definitely a valuable resource, but we won't be covering too much of that. All right, so in terms of clients for Apollo, just about any, I would say, popular front-end technology right now has a GraphQL or an Apollo client. So React Native, of course, Vue, Angular, and then if you're doing mobile, Android, iOS, Ember, and there are still even more than this that are listed here. All right, so some of the kind of out-of-the-box features you're going to get with using an Apollo client is caching and composing. So caching in terms of if you make the same request multiple times, it's going to have that request cached, so you're not going to make another round trip. Composing, and this one's really key, is that say you have a number of components that are making a request to your GraphQL endpoint. If you have it set up where that you're making those requests within, say, like I think it's 10 milliseconds, which is the default, you can actually batch those into a single request. So instead of making 10 trips to your API, you'll just make one, and Apollo will actually just handle all of that for you, and then provide the data to your components. Developer tooling, there's great tooling out there for Apollo and GraphQL. Optimistic UI, so one of the features that comes with Apollo is that you can, say you delete an item or update an item, it can actually update your local cache optimistically instead of waiting on your API. And then it'll handle updating the data in terms of, like, maybe you get an ID back from your server, it'll update your local cache if you have that configured. And then just kind of global error handling in terms of if you make a request or something fails, it will set some state, or not state, but update a prop within your React application, which we'll see a little bit later on in terms of what data is piped into your React components, your React application. All right. So server languages. So while this is React Indy Meetup, a lot of you probably do use JavaScript or at least know JavaScript. You don't have to use JavaScript to write your GraphQL server. So if you know any of these languages, and there are actually implementations and even more than this, you can get your GraphQL server set up. And then you can use any client on the front end that you would like. So if you're comfortable in any of these languages, you can use Apollo to get a GraphQL server set up. Okay. So on to your question that you had earlier. So one of the core tenets of GraphQL is that you're going to be using you can use your existing data. So you can use your GraphQL API to query your existing SQL database. You can query another, say, REST API, your Mongo database, anything that can give you data, essentially, you can return that from your GraphQL API. I believe that is too small. Okay. All right. So we're going to take a look at kind of how you would set up, and this is JavaScript. So if you don't know JavaScript, bear with me here. So we're going to take a look at actually defining what's called a schema, and these are all of the types that we are going to expose in our GraphQL API. So, and this is specific to Apollo now. So we have two types that are defined. So we have two types here. We have a query, and then we have our book. So the query is how we're going to be fetching data from our GraphQL API. And we have a books book type here, which has a title and author. And how we get that data with Apollo is we use something called a resolver. So as I was mentioning, that any kind of data source that we have, we can use that to fetch the data using this resolver method, and then that is what gets exposed via our GraphQL API. So, and Apollo natively supports promises, so you can just return a promise in terms of that resolver. So here we're just hitting already an existing API that returns us books, and that's how we return the books query within our Apollo API. And then at the bottom here, Apollo has this function that will take a schema and allow us to use it within our Apollo server. So next up, okay, so again, hopefully this is large enough. There we go. So we had the schema in the previous example. So now we're going to take that schema. We're using Express again with JavaScript, and we're going to mount that at the endpoint /GraphQL, and that is our single entry point into our GraphQL API. So the queries that we just exposed for that books endpoint. So there's that. And again, an example of using resolvers with our existing data. So if any of you SQLize will return promises. So you can just, if you're querying for authors or by an ID or specific parameters, or just returning all authors, you can just return those promises in your resolvers, and that's how it will resolve the data fetching for you. All right, so that was a lot. So next up is we're going to use an existing GraphQL API and pull down the Apollo client and see if we can get it to talk to that existing GraphQL API. Before that, though, questions? Yep.
Question with the type query when you were defining the schema. That's basically, it's called the root query.
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
And with that, though, it doesn't, you can, when you write a query, you don't have to return, I think it was the title and the author, I can't remember exactly.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to return all that data. You can select just the title or just the author.
Yes.
You have to have that root query.
Right. Yeah, and that's a good point. When you're defining it with your server, you're defining all of the possible values that your type has. So in this case, like you said, title and author, but I may only want the title. So when I write my query, I would just specifically ask for the title or author. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yep.
Yeah, what are some of the negatives of going with this approach? I'm assuming Facebook made this rather performance, so that's probably not, but it seems like it could be a solution.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say just kind of first off is just the learning curve. And it is definitely something that's kind of a paradigm shift for most people. I would say pretty much anyone. So yeah, that's definitely one of the downsides, I would say. And then you still are fetching the data on your server implementation. So you're still going to be kind of, if you're using existing APIs, you're still going to be subject to that kind of performance optimization that you still have to do. Maybe a smaller payload delivered to your client, but at the same time, if your issues are further down the line, it's not really going to solve that issue. Yeah, I'm trying to think of some others, but those are the two that definitely jump out to me. Yep. Yeah. So Apollo has, I would say, hooks for like authentication, and Apollo's documentation is actually really good. So I would definitely check that out. It's at the end of the slides. There's tons of resources, but yeah, Apollo will handle authentication for you. Another kind of, I would say, downside is that there are things that you can do with like a REST API, for instance, like file uploads. File uploads isn't something you're going to be doing with a GraphQL API. You may do an upload and then get the URL to that file and then store it in GraphQL, but you're not going to be doing like file uploads, things like that with GraphQL. So that's one of the downsides for sure. Yep.
All the live documentation for REST API, I think like Swagger,
Yeah.
where each route is well documented. How do you share the kind of model bindings that GraphQL requires in a meaningful manner so someone consuming the API needs to understand what they need?
Yeah. So the only only tool that I've used so far is this graphical interface, I suppose. When you do define your types, depending on your implementation, I do know that you can actually add comments when you're defining like your queries. So you could do it that way if someone is using something like this. But then again, it's still using like this specific tool. But this is the only tool that I've used in terms of like that type of documentation. Yeah.
So does it just traverse the models and basically what they look like? Or that's a simple tool to traverse the model lines?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So it looks at the schema that's generated, and then outputs that. Yep.
Maybe related to that, is that a client-side schema, or is that actually is there a call to the server to fetch the schema definition?
That's a good question. I actually don't know, but I don't remember seeing a client-side schema that it defines. So it probably does do some type of call like that. Yeah.
Maybe kind of to your point, I think there's some annotations you can put in the API called deprecated. So you can
Yes. Yeah.
fields within the API within the schema definition, which is kind of neat.
Yeah, and that's to that point is kind of one of the selling points that they try to use is that there's no versioning. Depending on how you write that may not actually be true, but you can add that like deprecation tag to a field, and then kind of version things that way. That's definitely a huge benefit. So yeah, good call out there. Yep.
Well, with graphical, it's another package that you download. It's a middleware that you put up in your server.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it may be different based on your server implementation, but I've mostly only used JavaScript or Node, so yeah. Yeah.
Is there so if you're using like a type system, like TypeScript or Flow or something, is there a way to kind of share type definitions between GraphQL schema? Or do you have to redefine them?
So I actually was looking at a project earlier today that will take your schema and generate those types. I haven't used it, but I do know the project exists. So people are definitely working on that. So yeah, good call. Good question.
I was just going to say that documentation explorer is built by doing an API call to a GraphQL endpoint.
Gotcha.
I think it's just performing a get on it, or it's adding this underscore schema thing.
Oh, nice.
I'm
Okay.
unclear on the detail of how it's built, but that is when you define your types, those types are sent to the client, which are used to help build the queries.
Cool. Thank you.
And there's also tools that will convert it to the Swagger or whatever.
Thanks. Cool. All right. So close this here. Cool. So we're going to kind of run through a super simple example of how to get this connected to React, because after all, this is React Indy. So we're going to use create React app to get our app started here. I'm going to hop over to my terminal. Right. Paste that in. Okay. So if you aren't familiar with create React app, just a quick overview. Essentially, it is the no configuration get started with React boilerplate. If you haven't used it, I would definitely recommend it because I'm basically up and running now with a simple React application. So helps if I actually go into that project. Okay, and start that up. Sure. Cool. So we have our application up and running. Cool. Next thing we're going to do, so we're actually going to install the Apollo client. So let's grab that and get that installed within our app here. So this is the Apollo kind of, I'd say starter kit more or less, but you can install Apollo's individual packages one by one if you kind of want to pick and choose. But but I'm just going to choose to install all of them at once. What's going on out there? All right, cool. So the first thing we're going to do is create an instance of the client that we're wanting to do. So this is how we're going to talk to our GraphQL API that we have set up. So I have the same Star Wars GraphQL API that we were taking a look at earlier, running on my local machine on port 5000. So that's what we're pointing to there. We're going to default to using the in-memory cache, and that's pretty much it. So let's grab that, and we're going to make sure the server is started here. Okay. So let's hop into editor. It's crazy small. Okay. So we're going to create a client file. We're going to paste this in here. Get this out of here. Okay. So we have the Apollo client set up. We're going to export that so that we can use that client to fetch data and pass and then eventually pass that data into our React component. So we have a React component. So once we have our client, the next thing we need to do is we need to use a provider. So if you've used Redux or React Redux together, you're likely familiar with the concept of a provider. So with React Redux, you're going to have a provider. You're going to provide it you're going to pass in your Redux store as the store prop. But in this case, you're going to be using a client, and that expects an Apollo client to be passed into your provider. And what this does is it will do the client will do the data fetching, and then when the data is returned, that'll then be passed into your React components so that you can use them when rendering those components. So we are going to grab that, go into our main file here. Let's make sure this is where we want this. Yep, okay. Make sure I don't delete anything I would actually need here. Okay. And then we don't need to render the old components. So again, we have our Apollo provider that we're importing from React Apollo. That's the React client for Apollo. And then just our basic app component that was set up with create React app. And then we passed in our client as a prop here. And that's just going to render again on the root ID of this application. So again, it isn't started. Let me start this up. We start up the application. Again, we shouldn't see any change visually here. Oh, did I name it the same? No. Okay. Casing. Okay, so there you go. So no change in the application yet, but we have set up our provider. So really the last bit is to write our query so that we can get the data back from GraphQL, and then we will pass it into a React component. Okay, so we're going to import this GraphQL function from React Apollo, and then this GQL package that allows us to create a GraphQL query from just the like JavaScript string template that we have here. So we'll grab that, and we'll talk about the query here a little bit. So let's open up our app.js. I'm going to get rid of all of this. Cool. Deleting too much here. Okay. So we're constructing a query, and we're going to be looking for all people within this this GraphQL API. We're going to say that we want the first 15, and then we have to describe the shape of the person or the people that we're getting back. So we're looking for their ID, their name, and then again, like we saw earlier, their related home world type, and just the name of that home world. I'm going to change this here to just going to be a stateless components. So we just have our div here, not doing anything yet with that query. So the last thing that we need to do to actually get the data is we need to use yet another, we need to actually use the function that we imported, the GraphQL function from the React Apollo client. And this is like a higher order function. So if you're familiar with like the connect function when using React Redux, it's similar. So you're going to give it the query that you're wanting to use, and then you're going to, as a second, as the second part of it, you're going to be passing in the component that you want to use with it. And let's grab that. I'll talk about that here in a sec. So here's our app. So earlier I mentioned that Apollo is going to set up some kind of helper props that are going to be passed into your components. So this loading Boolean that's being passed in, that's being provided from the React Apollo, that client. So whenever you're doing a request to your GraphQL API, that's going to be setting that to true or false, depending on what the state is in your app. So when we are loading from the API, we're going to set just return a string saying loading. Then otherwise, we're going to return this component here that's going to render the results from that query. And you can see that the shape that we're getting back is just like kind of the request that we're making. So we have an all people object that has people defined here as an array of people, and we're going to map over that array and then print out a list item for each of those people that we have. We have the ID that's coming back, the name, we have their home world, and then also the name for that home world. So if we save that, we hop back over here, we can now see that we're actually talking to our GraphQL API. If we go to localhost 5005, again, so we can see the same API that's running on our local machine, all people, and we can say first 15, and we want their names, people, their name, and we can just run that. So we're hitting the same API that's on our local machine, but we're using the client. And one of the huge benefits, so if you just need to make a small change on your front end when using GraphQL, it's super simple in terms of, so say you don't need to show the home world information anymore. You can just remove that. Maybe change it to say only top 10. And now it's only showing the top 10. It's not getting all of that extra information back. So really quickly iterate on front-end changes as long as the types are defined for you. So if you're kind of more of a front-end developer that maybe has to wait on API changes, that's probably something that you would really love. So yeah, that's a basic React and Apollo client demo there. All right. So real quick about this demo. So it's React Indy. Obviously, it would make sense to build the React demo with React. So there's a project out there called Spectacle. That's that I use to build this application. It's by the team over, I think it's Formidable Labs. So if you're doing any talks, building any presentations, and you're wanting to use React, I would check it out. And lastly, there's tons of good resources out there on GraphQL. I've kind of put together a list of items that I found really useful when prepping for this talk. Also, these slides are out there as well. So feel free to check those out. And that's it. Cool. Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
How complicated is it to write the server side? Like, you have to, are there tools for that, or do you have to write everything like you would normally?
Yeah. So I've only done, I would say, basic implementations in terms of the server-side code. I didn't find it really that cumbersome, especially when one of the smaller applications I built was wrapping an existing API that was, unfortunately, was in XML, which, that's great. So taking an existing XML API and just returning the data as promises with resolvers. And I was able to get that set up in maybe an hour or so, returning data to my client. So yeah, at least with Node and JavaScript, it's fairly straightforward. Again, the Apollo documentation is really good. This Apollo starter here is actually from the Apollo blog, and they basically take you from 0 to having your client and server set up. And one of the cool things about it is they show you kind of the different flavors that you could go with. So they show you talking to, I think, a Postgres database, talking to Mongo, and then there's one other, but it's kind of showing you the flexibility of GraphQL. So it's a really good resource. Yep.
How might you integrate Apollo with Redux?
Yeah. So as far as I can tell, usually it's more or less one or the other. I'm sure that you could, but I haven't seen any people doing it. That is a really good question. So, yeah.
If you can't integrate the two, then can you do things within the cache that it has? Or you have to work outside the cache? How do you kind of update the cache?
Yeah. So I do know they do give you access to the cache. So I would assume you could probably come up with some way to use Redux with that cache. But I have not seen any examples of people doing that. But yeah, I'd be really curious to see how those two would work together. I think one of the first implementations of their client did use Redux under the hood, but I think that they kind of went away from that, and they're like V2 of their client. So, yep.
Well, my question was kind of along those lines too. I haven't seen any examples, but I know a couple of places that they reduced how much Redux they were using. So I guess some people are still using both. But I was going to ask if you had looked at Apollo client, or what's Apollo link state?
Yeah.
Which is kind of like it is meant to be their state solution.
Yeah. Yeah. I haven't used link state that much, but I do know that it is super useful in terms of storing, like you said, storing your application state on the client. You can actually tell Apollo to specifically only use cache data with certain types of queries. So if you're really worried about performance and you want to make sure that you're getting a cache hit, you can. So if you want to fetch a large list of items and then on subsequent pages or something, you would always want to use that cache, you can. So, but yeah, Apollo link state is definitely something that if you're that you should look into for sure. Yeah. Yep.
I was just going to ask about like Relay versus Apollo, or like when would you kind of pick one over the other, or what are the trade-offs, I guess?
Yeah. So for the most part, I think everyone I've talked to has just kind of favored Apollo over Relay. I think the kind of get up and running time on Apollo is really fast. I have heard though that if you really want to kind of pick and choose and be really, really explicit about what you want to do with your GraphQL API. Relay can offer a little more flexibility, but yeah, I haven't really used Relay too much. Apollo is the one that I keep hearing everyone gush about. So yeah. Anyone else? Cool. All right. Thanks.